Welcome back. This week in digital photography, we're taking a look at exposures part 2. We'll be diving into how to read a histogram and looking at basic metering patterns for your light meters. The histogram is a tool that many modern cameras include that allow you to have a visual representation of the tones in the image, the dark tones and the light tones in an image. So if we look at an image that is very dark, like the model silhouette, we are going to find that there's lots and lots of pixels that are going to highlight on this graph that are going to be on the dark side, and very few that are going to highlight on the bright side. So let's take a few examples. If we see this particular image, we're going to see an image that has a lot of dark pixels, a few midtones, but it's really declining to almost no midtones, and then very, very few bright pixels. This is going to give me an image that is going to be well below or much darker than average tone. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a bad image. It just means that it's going to be darker than mid-tone. So let's take a look at what this image might look like. This image was photographed up in the Adirondacks, and clearly it's very much a dark image. There are some highlights in the sky here, but overall it's a dark image. Had I photographed this at mid-tone, it would have appeared washed out and would have had less vibrant colors and certainly wouldn't have given the feel of a sunset. So I chose to decrease my exposure to be able to accomplish this. We can look at decreasing our exposure by closing down our aperture and using an aperture with a bigger number. Say instead of shooting it at f4, maybe I shoot it at f16. That's going to cut down the amount of light reaching the shutter. I could also use a shorter shutter speed to accomplish an image that is darker than what the light meter would indicate. So if the light meter suggested maybe 1/100th of a second, maybe I shoot it at 1/200th of a second and make it twice as dark. Here we look at a histogram that is just the opposite. We have lots of tones that are on the bright side and very few tones that are over here in the dark side. This image is going to be what we call high key or bright, and this might be an example of that kind of an image. There's a lot of bright white. There are some midtones, but there's really no really dark tones in this image. This was also photographed in the Adirondacks this past fall. In this particular histogram, as we look at it, we see all of our tones are kind of bunched in the middle. We don't have anything super dark. We don't have anything super bright. This is what we would typically consider to be that zone 5 or average exposure. And this image comes from a senior portrait I shot here at the Ontario County Park this past October. And as you can see, there's a full range here of some fairly dark tones, but also some fairly bright tones. But really, everything for the most part sits pretty close to mid-toned. And on this image, we're looking at a histogram that shows lots of dark, lots of bright, but really not a whole lot right in the middle. So this is what we would call a high contrast image. And this is another one from the Adirondacks from a hike that I did about 2 years ago. Here we see lots of blocked up shadows. We also see lots of blown out highlights. This is an example of an image that would probably not fit into that mid-tone, even though if I were to blend it all together, it would turn out to be mid-tone. But the reality is I have lots of pixels that are dark and lots of pixels that are bright and not a lot that's in between. Where we have to be careful is in an image like this where we have lots of pixels that are pushed right up against the upper margin or right down at the bottom margin is a phenomenon that we refer to as clipping. When the image contains pixels that are so dark or so bright, they will lose all detail. There will be no texture, no nothing to them. And if we find that a lot of our pixels are bunched up in that area, we tend to find that our image doesn't have much texture to it. Now we do have the option, if we were to adjust the exposure on this image, we could actually lower the exposure and get details up on the highlights. If we darken the overall image, we would end up getting enough texture into the highlights that we could see like cloud shadows and things like that. But all of our midtones would also get darker to the point that they would be off the bottom edge and completely black. So in looking at this image, we allowed this image to go pure white here and pure black in the shadows without really that fine gradation of tones in between. Here it was acceptable for the image that I was making, but generally speaking, it's best form to avoid these high contrast images unless you have a good reason for doing so. Many cameras will have a variety of different metering modes or ways that the camera will interpret the light that's coming into the camera. Probably the most common that you'll see typically in point and shoot cameras and even in your DSLR cameras, the one pattern that most photographers will use unless there's a reason to shoot something different is a mode called evaluative metering. Evaluative metering means that we're going to divide up this sensor into a bunch of different zones or areas, and it will determine the amount of light reaching here, the amount of light here, the amount of light here, the amount of light here, and the amount of light here, all separately. And it will put a little bit more weight in its calculations on whatever is in the middle. This is what Nikon refers to as matrix metering. Canon calls it pattern metering. And most brands have their own word for it, but whatever they're calling it, it's a form of looking at the light in each of these different zones and weighting it to give more emphasis on whatever is right in the middle. This particular image has 5 zones, but many cameras have more zones than that. Sometimes we find ourselves looking at an image where the meter would easily be tricked by all of this brightness and would close down our shutter speed or our aperture and give us an underexposed image. And one way the camera can overcome that is to use a metering mode known as spot metering, where instead of looking at all of this area, it's going to ignore all of that, and it's going to take its reading from just this very center part of the image. Spot meter can be anywhere from 1% to 4% of the image, depending on the particular camera that you're using. But it's only going to pay attention to that very small portion of the image when it calculates its exposure. And center-weighted metering is a combination of the two, and it's basically a broader version of a spot metering. It will still continue to ignore all of the outside edge, but it will take a reading in the middle that is much larger than 4%. It could be as much as 30% of a scene, 33% of a scene, to determine the exposure. So if you had a lot of bright highlights out on the outside that you didn't want to impact your exposure, one option would be to use center-weighted metering on your camera. That wraps up our basics of exposure. We are now going to head over and take a look at some basic composition techniques. So join us on the next video.